When the Second World War broke out in 1939, it began a period of immense upheaval and change, with a heavy price tag.
An diesen Opfern ein unerbittliches Gericht zu halten.
In a world stunned by this Holocaust, Britain moved decisively and with finality. She declares war on Germany. In that hour, Australia also moved.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you Australia is also at war.
Lasting 6 years and costing the lives of up to 85 million people. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. A watershed in Australian history. The nation's mobilisation for total war was unprecedented. To date, it has never been equalled.
If you've thought about it, think no longer. Act. Do it now. The immediate safety of Australia and the Empire demands their services.
There was never any doubt that Australia would play an active role in the conflict. For a nation whose people were then overwhelmingly of British descent,
There you are, boys.
and whose country's defence and economy were intertwined with the British Empire, Australia was always going to be in the fight.
In the military forces.
In the military forces
Of the Commonwealth of Australia.
of the Commonwealth of Australia.
With only a small pre-war militia of mainly part-time citizen soldiers, a new expeditionary force had to be raised across land, sea and air to join the fight for king and country. The army would enlist 726,000 men and women, mobilised in some 5,800 separate units. The Royal Australian Navy would expand from just 13 warships to 150 vessels and 200 auxiliary craft by war's end.
I tell you that the need of the hour is desperate. Without the help of the young men of Australia, we cannot win this war.
And with around 3,300 officers and men at the start of the war, by 1945, the Royal Australian Air Force would grow to become one of the largest air forces in the world. All in all, close to 1 million Australians, both men and women, would serve. Half of them overseas. It was in the skies above Europe and the deserts of North Africa that Australia's skill, bravery and endurance came to be known in legendary battles like Tobruk and El Alamein.
In one period of 52 days, the Luftwaffe made over 1,400 sorties against us. We dug ourselves out and then dug ourselves in again. Before long, got quite used to it.
But then came Japan's entry into the war on the 7th of December 1941.
A date which will live in infamy.
Its rapid advance through Southeast Asia and across the Pacific would come to define Australia's war.
We've made the planes, we've made the engines, we've got the men to fly them. We shall answer strength with strength.
Overnight, it went from a faraway conflict to one now waged on Australia's doorstep. When Singapore fell on the 15th of February, 150,000 Allied troops, including 2/3 of an Australian division, were taken prisoner. Now nothing stood between the Japanese forces and mainland Australia. Four days later, Darwin was bombed for the first time. Australian Prime Minister John Curtin described early 1942 as the gravest hour in our history. But it was just the beginning. It was on the Burma-Thailand Railway and the Sandakan death marches that Australian soldiers came to learn the true meaning of suffering and sacrifice. All up the mainland was bombed nearly 100 times during the war. Northern Australia bore the brunt of this assault, but fear and panic spread when Japanese submarines began shelling Sydney and Newcastle. Merchant ships were sunk up and down the east coast, and a passenger ferry was torpedoed in Sydney Harbour.
In those days, Australia was a land of vast resources, untouched and unknown. She was a mighty giant asleep.
The government mobilised its population, economy and industry for total war, enacting a series of unprecedented restrictions and controls over the daily lives of Australians. Rationing became an ever-present reminder of what everyone simply called the war. It was also a time of great social change. Almost 70,000 women served in the forces and in non-combat roles, with thousands more joining the production effort in factories. Indigenous Australians serving in uniform likewise began to experience a greater level of equality, with at least 5,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people serving directly in the military, and thousands more working in ancillary roles supporting the war effort in Northern Australia. As the war dragged on, the mammoth effort began to pay off.
In the Pacific, and where American, Australian, and New Zealanders are fighting together, the strength of Japan has been steadily and remorselessly worn down.
During 1943 and early 1944, Australian and American forces launched a major offensive against the Japanese in New Guinea. It was the largest military offensive ever conducted by Australian forces. In Europe, following the storming of Normandy by the Allies in 1944, German forces surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945.
We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day.
A few months later, Japan surrendered on the 15th of August.
Japan's final surrender took place in Tokyo Bay aboard the American battleship Missouri, in the presence of the Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Army, the Chief of Staff of the Australian Forces, and high-ranking officers of the Allied forces.
Rejoicing broke out spontaneously all across Australia, with wild scenes of celebration. Australia suffered heavy losses in the Second World War, but it also emerged confident and with an independent outlook. We now enjoyed a more sophisticated relationship with Britain and found in the United States a new and powerful ally, while the influx of post-war migration from Britain and war-torn Europe forever diversified Australia's population and society. And while the women who had worked in the factories were now expected to return to their homes to become wives and mothers again, they fostered in their daughters the spirit of independence and equality that helped drive the women's movements of the 1960s. There are 4 words carved on stone plinths at the end of the Kokoda Trail: courage, endurance, mateship, and sacrifice. These words perfectly sum up all those Australians who fought overseas and on our doorstep, and who supported the war effort on the home front.
Once the jolly swagman camped by a billabong, under the shade of a juniper tree, and he sang as he watched and waited till his billy boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me, waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me.
Most of these men and women are no longer with us. But 75 years on from the end of that conflict, their sacrifice and achievements have had a lasting significance, giving us the prosperity that too often we take for granted. More than any other conflict, It was the Second World War that shaped modern Australia.
You'll have a waltzing Matilda with thee. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda. You'll have a waltzing Matilda with me. And he sang as he closed that jumbuck in his tucker bag.